So this is a really interesting and sort of perplexing story that is also very sad and unfortunate. So, my dad was born in Afghanistan and stayed there up until he was like 30, after which he left just before the country became radicalized. He lived in the countryside surrounded by the forest, eerie caves, and quiet mountains. In Afghanistan, the people are very wary of the jinn, and they don't go out after sunset because of horrifying things that have happened to people. Even during my dad's time in Afghanistan, the people were always careful never to let their kids play out in the woods alone unless they were in a really large group of people. But my dad had a brother who was 3 years younger than him, making him 11 years old at the time, and his name was Dean. They would often dare each other to do silly things during the night without their parents knowing, which is pretty typical for kids, right? And this particular night, my dad and his brothers had stayed up late, and they decided to dare Dean to run into the woods behind their home, stay there for about 2 minutes, and run back inside the home. I know this might seem simple enough, but keep in mind that they practically lived in the middle of nowhere, and the stories of the jinn terrified everyone. So my Uncle Dean left from the back door and entered the woods. They waited for about a minute when they suddenly heard a loud scream. My dad was in the army for 4 years, and he's seen some pretty terrifying things, but he always says that the sound of his brother screaming will always haunt him for the rest of his life like nothing else. My dad and his brothers quickly rushed over to see Dean on the forest floor with his eyes wide open and sort of in a state of shock. They tried to get him to talk, but he couldn't for some reason. He just had tears falling out of his eyes and he was shaking. This carried on for 3 days, and they called doctors and religious exorcists to treat him, but in the end they couldn't save him. He passed away soon after, and for those 3 days he couldn't move, talk, or eat. Nobody really knows what he saw too. Some think that it was a jinn, but the thing is that I know my family members who have seen jinns or have been haunted by them, and yes, they've been afraid, but nothing like this has ever happened to them. My dad's eyes, though, they always water when he tells us this story because, well, he blames himself for what happened. So this occurred in a small town in Illinois. I was 16 at the time, I'm now 28, and I didn't have much adult supervision at this time. I had spent the night at a friend's house, and around noon the next day decided to walk to my boyfriend at the time's house. He lived about 4 miles away, on the other side of town. But my friend lived on the outskirts, with about a half a mile of highway between her home and the official city limits. So I set out on my journey. I remember not being thrilled about the walk, and lit a cigarette as I got out onto the highway, being careful to walk on the edge, in the dirt, putting about 3 to 4 feet of distance between myself and any passing vehicles. As I walked, I heard the distinctive sound of a car pulling up behind me, though. I turned to see a newer, dark, red SUV rolling slowly until it stopped next to me. The passenger side window rolled down to reveal a friendly-looking old man. He was all smiles. To give a little bit more context too, my brother and I were raised by our single, hard-working father, with one of the core values of respect and responsiveness to the elderly. As a result, my brother and I have a major soft spot for old people, like most would for children, say. So I didn't in any way perceive this guy as a threat. "Hey there, are you Anne's granddaughter?" he asked. Yeah, sure am," I responded. "This road's pretty dangerous, you know. You wouldn't want to ride, would you?" he asked me, very casually. I thought about this for only a second before I agreed. I really did feel that I would be safe with this man, especially considering that he knew my grandma, who was sort of a pillar of the community where I live. As I climbed in, I realized that I still had a lit cigarette. Is it alright if I smoke in the car?" "Sure," he quickly answered. Okay, that's pretty cool, right? I'm obviously not an adult. I look younger than I was. And this dude's letting me smoke in his car and giving me a free ride, all because he knows my grandma? Neat, I thought. He introduced himself quickly as Danny too, and as we entered the city limits, he asked where I was headed. I told him the direction to my boyfriend's house, by Walgreens on the east end of town, and asked him if it was too far to get to, and also assured him that he could drop me off any time. But he was perfectly fine. I felt good about our arrangement too, until he started talking to me about his brother. "You wouldn't be smoking those things if you met my brother, you know," he suddenly said, sort of ominously. I glanced at the cigarettes and then to him to see his face suddenly stern. Excuse me?" I stuttered. "He's dying of lung cancer." "Oh, I'm really sorry to hear that," I blurted, and immediately tossed the cigarette out the window. It was almost gone anyway, but I figured that would be the end of it. Boy, was I wrong. "Yeah, well, he's in the hospital right now. He's probably very lonely, in fact. We should go and see him. He would want to meet you, for sure." Now, I started to panic. This place that he mentioned was like several hours away from where I lived, and was this man threatening to kidnap me? I don't want to go there today," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Maybe tomorrow?" "Yeah, sure, we can go tomorrow, but you'll have to stay tonight at my house then. I don't live in this town." And at that, I felt my stomach drop. I had to get out of this car quickly. I knew that we were getting close, and I was running out of time too, but I'm not sure why. I just started yammering on about how my dad taught my brother and I to fight. I then went into a story about me getting arrested for beating up my bully. He didn't reply during these stories, but I could tell that he was thinking. As Walgreens appeared on my right, I announced firmly that he could drop me off right here. He pulled me into the parking lot, and I flung that door open immediately, jumped out while the car was still moving, in fact. I took the opportunity to run down the neighborhood alley and through my boyfriend's back door. Once inside, I just broke down crying. His dad went back to look for the guy, but, of course, he was gone by now. Admittedly, I went on with my day after that. I tried not to let it bother me too much. That is, until I talked to my grandmother a couple of weeks later about the occurrence. She didn't recognize the description of the man, nor did she know anyone named Danny. She was, however, concerned with how he knew her. At this point, I must mention that my grandmother was chief of bailiffs at our county courthouse for like over 30 years, which meant that if he wasn't her friend, then there's really only one other option for how they cross paths. I think I was pretty lucky that day, and fate was on my side. This happened when I was born, up until the point when I was 9 and moved out, in the early 2000s. So when I was a kid, I just lived in a pretty normal suburban British home built in the 30s, like most interwar houses too in large British cities. It was that repetitive design which spanned an entire street, but there was just something strange about this one in particular. It just had things which, to this day, I haven't seen since. One encounter I kept on seeing was at night between 8 p.m. up to before 6 or 7 a.m. when I woke up for school. I saw what I can only describe as a smoke or steam floating around the room every so often. This never really stopped too, it just happened for the whole 9 years that I was there. And at night, I saw this odd dark black shape, which was even darker than the darkness of the room itself, and carried this odd white thing in its hand. I think it was a knife, but I'm not too sure, and it wasn't sleep paralysis as I thought it was, because I can remember after I saw it running to my mum and crying out and sleeping with them. And you may be thinking, have you seen this outside of your room? Well, yeah. My sister took a photo of me with my phone, and forgot what it was, but I'm sure it was an early iPhone, I think. And there was this massive black figure behind me, maybe like 6 or 7 feet. We deleted that photo right away, as my parents were very superstitious and saw taking a photo of a ghost as bad luck, as if having a ghost wasn't bad luck in the first place. But also, another minor incident that happened was after closing the door to the downstairs bathroom, I heard a loud manly scream, and I mean loud. The whole house heard it too, and though I was like 5, so It couldn't have been me because it was a really deep one, and it wasn't my dad too because he worked long-haul trucking in Europe and only came back on weekends, so it was only me, my mum and my sister, and the source of the scream just remained unknown. Of course, you had the normal slamming doors and the lights turning off for no reason, and even TVs just turning on. In fact, I still have that TV, but it doesn't do it anymore. Another really unexplained thing too was just the straight up bad luck of the house, as my parents were in constant financial problems until we actually moved out. We still don't know what caused it, but we might know who caused it, as my dad said that one time he was doing some research and found out that there was a lady who died there in the 1920s. I was never told further than that, and we did try to get it out of the local priest, but to no avail. The priest actually knew us really well because of all this too. Did we try to debunk it? No, mainly though because there was just too much evidence that it was true. Sadly, there isn't any photographic or audio evidence of it, but we definitely saw things. And so we just never really tried. But I still would like to hear some of your theories if you guys would like to share. And thanks for listening. A lot of these posts are about men creeping at women, but this one's a little different. So, this one takes place in early 2010. I was 16 years old and played lacrosse. I liked girls, but I didn't know much about flirting or anything. And one day I was just heading home with my stuff, and a woman walked up to me and asked if I played. I told her that I did, and I was captain of my team, since I was so proud of that. And she said that it was interesting and asked me how old I was. I told her that I was 16, and she laughed and said that she was 38 years old. After this, she told me that I was cute and said that she would love to come to one of my games. This woman told me to take her number down several times, so I did, but I didn't plan on texting her or anything. The next day, I was talking to a teammate, and I told him about the incident. He laughed and told me that I was a liar, but to prove it, I decided to text her and ask her her age again. She responded with, "Baby, I'm 38. Hope I'm not too old for you. When's your next game?" I didn't know what to say, so I just showed him and I didn't respond. She then double texted me and sent me a few nudes, and I felt really put off by this, so I told her that I was going to go and practice, and I didn't respond. Now, later that night, she texted me asking what I was doing and if I wanted to come over. I told her that I can't because I'm doing homework, plus like my age and everything, but she told me that she would help out and show me a few things, to which I said no, and had a bit of a mini panic attack, but I turned my phone off and I just went to bed. A few days later, I was getting ready for my next game when I see a familiar face in the stands. I look closer and it's her. "Hi, Wheels," she says. My stomach dropped. I mustered the guts though to wave back, and I tried to put it to the back of my mind, but I couldn't shake it. After the game, she came up to me and asked if I wanted to come over, and I told her I normally shower after games, and she said that I could use hers. I then told her me and some teammates were hanging out and tried to walk off, but this woman grabbed my arm and asked why I've been dodging her. She asked if I was man enough for her and said that I need to stop playing games. My coach heard and came over and asked if everything was good, to which I said no, and tried to get her off of me, and my coach ended up having to restrain her while I backed away. As I'm walking away, I hear her say, "Whatever you say," and a whole bunch of expletives, and I just felt so sick that I honestly almost vomited. After this, I had to have a meeting with my coach, my parents, and the principal of my school as well. They explained to me that this woman was wrong and should not have sent me those messages or come to my game like that. They reassured me that I did nothing wrong, which is why I didn't tell them about this sooner, and that this woman was nutty as a squirrel. I promised myself and my parents too that if I ever did see her again that I would press charges for stalking and for sending nudes to a minor, but I never did. Anyway, that's my story, and like I said, it's not the norm, but I felt like I should share it. So I'm on a trip backpacking around Europe with my brother, currently in Paris. We're staying in this hostel and we're in a 10-bunk bedroom. There was this one guy in the room who was immediately super weird. Almost right away, in fact. Like, as soon as we got settled, he starts talking to us about flying to Libya. He's all, us Libya, fly tomorrow, and me and my brother were just like, no dude. He keeps saying it though, and we keep saying no, and he's getting progressively more assertive about it. As me and my brother are going around doing some sightseeing and stuff, I keep seeing this dude around as well. When we're at the hostel, he kept following us to the dining hall, out onto the terrace, and I'm getting more and more creeped out. My brother, ever the non-assertive soul that he is, just laughs it off like the dude is joking. This goes on for 2 days, and well, this morning, we were going out to breakfast, and I forgot my phone back in the room, so I told my brother to just go ahead, and I ran back to get it. I go in the room, and the dude is sitting there. There's no one else in the room, and I honestly contemplated just leaving it, but I didn't trust it alone in the room, so I planned to just grab it quickly. That morning he was still on about Libya and was essentially bending over our beds going on about it, despite me repeatedly telling him to stop talking to us. I go in and grab my phone when he suddenly just yells, "Libya, now, we go now." I'm very scared since at this point we're the only ones in this room, and I just say, "No dude," and I go to leave when he blocks the door and grabs my shoulder, still going on about going to the airport and flying to Libya. I shove past him and run away to where my brother and I were going to breakfast. I decided that we're going to switch rooms because this dude was officially creep level 100. We make it back to the hostel, and before we talk to the front desk, we went outside for a smoke and he shows up. I almost yell at him this time to leave us alone, and he just flat out says no. I go to the front desk and explain that this dude has been harassing us and we wanted to change rooms. I mentioned what went down in the room, and before I knew it, the cops were called and I was giving a statement. As they were sorting it out though, there were a couple of things that really jumped out at me. The first was that this guy didn't pay in advance. Normally when you're staying in a hostel, you pay the full amount up front, or if you're staying for a while, you pay weekly. He was apparently paying by the day. And the second thing, he had several pieces of ID in his wallet, none of which matched his description. Apparently Paris has been having a problem with human trafficking, and this guy was escorted out of the hostel by the police. He was banned from staying there again ever, and me and my brother switched rooms and were given vouchers for free dinners for the rest of our stay there. And now, I'm terrified to go out by myself. I swear, if me and that guy had been alone in a more secluded place that didn't have cameras everywhere, I'm pretty sure that I would have been shipped off to Libya. So I was only a baby when this happened, and this is technically my mum's story. A bit of background. My mum had me pretty young. She was 21 and she wasn't married. Her and my dad were only dating when I was born, and she was about 22 when this whole thing occurred. But they both went to the same church with friends that they had met in high school, Louis, Christine, and Quill. My mum was riding in Quill's car at the time. I was a 1-year-old in the back seat. Mum basically took me everywhere, and everyone was heading towards a church event that they were all excited for. Louis, my dad, and Christine were all in separate cars, but they trailed Quill because they were all heading in the same place anyway. At some point, my mum and Quill were stuck at a stoplight. They were chatting until my mum says that she just got this really uneasy feeling. She never had a problem with people keeping their doors unlocked, but she just couldn't shake how she felt at that moment. Finally, she spoke up, requesting what she suddenly felt was necessary. She said, "Hey Quill, can you please lock the doors?" Quill was confused. It was an odd thing for my mum, the monarch of never locking doors, to ask this. And he said, "What? Wait, why?" And she said, "I don't know, I just have a feeling about it." Quill didn't object, locking the doors just as my mother asked. The light went green and everyone drove off. It wasn't until the next stoplight that my mum and Quill both experienced something that sure made them glad that they had actually locked the doors. As they sat there chatting away, these two guys from a car next to them got out of their vehicles. Mind you, we're on a road with a bunch of other people next to us, so these guys must have been drunk or high or something. But quickly, they make their way over to Quill's car, one on each side. They begin to feverishly pull on the door handles, trying desperately to get it open. My mum and Quill screamed. They were still at a stoplight and couldn't move without hitting the cars next to them. And after realizing that my mum's door didn't work, one of them went for the door closest to me. He tried to open it with all of his might, until him and his douchebag buddy started to try and break the windows. Thankfully, the light turned green, and Quill sped them out of there quickly. My mum and Quill were both in shock. Christine called them, freaking out because she saw the whole thing from a couple of cars behind. She asked them if they were okay, which, although being in shock, they weren't harmed. My dad called her and told her that he and Louie were going to handle it, which my mum believed, and they all went on their way. To this day, my mum says that she still doesn't know what my dad and Louie did to the guys. My dad said that he found them, but that's all that he would say about it. Louie acted similarly, not speaking of what happened, and even after my parents got married and got divorced, she still doesn't have a clue. The first year of middle school, a lot of things happened that I believe really shouldn't have. About a month before school started, a day before my birthday in fact, I got my period for the first time. I know, sorry for that, but it's actually important to the story. I called my friend a few days afterward to tell her. I was a bit of an early bloomer, so I was one of the first in my friend group to start. Well, later on, this particular friend of mine and I got into a fight, and her retaliation was to start a rumor about me around the school that I was pregnant and had sex with a high schooler. Throughout the day, I noticed people giving me weird looks, and I had no idea what it was about until my friends told me. I came home bawling my eyes out, and my sister knew why. Being in a small town, rumors spread like wildfire, and everyone already knew about it. This girl at the school that my sister was at told her about it, and she went off at her. This started a whole chain of events, with me crying, figuring out who it was, and my mum at the principal's not leaving until they promised to do something about it. It slowly started getting better, but walking home from school, I live nearly across the street, became just hell. I never learned this guy's name, but the first day he followed me around on his bike with his best friend. They circled around me, so I had to stop walking, ask me personal questions, which I'd either stay silent or say something snappy, and just a bunch of things to purposefully make me uncomfortable. On the third day, he kept making sexual comments about my body to the point that even his friend said, "Too far, man." After that, he never had his friend with him, and I just kind of broke down a few days of it happening. I was always a really shy, quiet kid. I spent most of elementary school just not talking to anyone. I had no idea how to handle it, and I was scared to ask for help because I didn't think anybody would believe me or take it too seriously. And so I simply just didn't say anything. The last day of it happening, though, I think was the worst. He had a group of girls behind him all cheering him on as he was harassing me, and one of them laughed and said, "You should stalk her." And he actually agreed with her, and I'd finally had enough, and I started screaming and cussing him out. He smirked and said, "Feisty, I like it," and I just ran home. I was already at the halfway point. My sister was waiting for me at the front door that day with our dog, only a few months old, so she had heard the whole thing, and she didn't do that often, but it seemed like perfect timing, and she looked panicked and was just like, "Are you okay? Do I need to hurt someone?" and told me that I need to report that to the school. I said that I was fine though, and it was taken care of. She was reluctant, but she let it go. But then he walked past my house, and our dog jumped in front of me and started growling at him. He just sort of chuckled, which really freaked both me and my sister out. A few months before, our house had actually gotten broken into, and because I was home alone a lot, my mum decided to get me a dog to protect me. She's a sweetheart though, and lets people pat her and everything. That's why my sister would sometimes wait for me outside and let kids pet her. But he was one of the only people that she's ever growled at. I'm really afraid that if I didn't stand up for myself or had a dog, that he would have actually followed up on the threat of stalking me. I only saw him around school a couple of times, or once on the student news because he was on the football team and got this award or something. I almost started crying when I saw it, and when he went up to my lunch table because my friend asked him a question and he stared at me the entire time. The last time that I saw him was the last day of school, and I was getting things out of my locker, and when I walked past him, his breath hitched and he just looked at me the entire time that I was in the hallway. There are a lot of reasons why I hate that town, but after I graduated from 8th grade, he was the biggest reason why I didn't want to go to that high school there. I'm glad that my mum accepted and we moved into the city, and I've had to deal with a fair share of creeps, but he was by far the worst of them. When I was young, I lived in my uncle's basement apartment with my grandparents. This damn place just always gave out the most creepiest of vibes, especially when I was there alone. It had those gnarly yellow light bulbs in the early 90s splashing light off the brick-walled interior, and it just gave the whole place an eerie yellowish-brown tinge. It always just gave me the creeps. Now, one early fall evening, my grandpa was out with friends while my grandma would do the usual Sunday afternoon ritual where she would make a gigantic pot of whatever stew or curry dish, and she would break it down into serve-size portions and then freeze them to be used or eaten throughout the week. The house was old and getting to the point where creaks and bangs from walls were a pretty normal occurrence. I was also convinced that parts of the floor were unlevel, as the door to my bedroom, when opened to a certain angle, would slowly begin to close on its own, making a creaking noise the whole way. So, for example, if you open the door at a 90-degree angle, it would slowly close itself to a 25 angle, but never actually slam shut. The windows were spread out throughout the basement, but they were those slim 9 by 18 inches or whatever sliding windows that were way up top of the wall and too high for me or Grandma to reach without using a chair. Only Grandpa was tall enough to access them without help. So, on this Sunday afternoon, my grandma proceeds to start cooking as the choice of curry dish that she had thought up required a good 4 to 5 hour slow simmer. I was in the living room or family room just kind of bouncing around, building planes out of Lego and playing rescue missions with the little Lego men. In the kitchen, the stove was in the corner, and across the stove, maybe a good 6-foot gap, was the fridge. Above the stove was one of the windows that I mentioned earlier. So, Grandma starts the simmer and casually joins me in the living or the family room and turns on a movie as she normally would on a Sunday afternoon. I wasn't really into the movie at first. It was some foreign one, but once the action scene started with all the kung fu and the fists flying, I was pretty captivated, so I joined her on the couch, spellbound by all those explosions and people fighting all over the place. Occasionally, every 10 to 15 minutes or so, my grandma would pause the movie to go check on whatever she was cooking as the aroma started to fill the entire basement, and I'm sure the whole upstairs house as well. Sometimes I would join her, being the curious little tyke that I was, and ask questions like, "Did you use tomatoes today? Is there meat in there? Where did you learn how to make this?" Grandma always responded and explained in detail. She was always proud of making food for us. So, as we're nearing the end of the movie, we are both startled by a loud bang and a crashing noise. My grandma jumps off the couch and goes dashing into the kitchen with me maybe 3 steps behind her. And what I saw that day, I still can't explain. The big pot of food that I was mentioning was laying next to the fridge on the other side of the kitchen. The curry had splashed all over the wall and spilled all over the floor, and some of it even on the fridge. In my panicked state, I stream off stuff like "what the hell" questions for Grandma, who went eerily silent as she grabbed towels and began cleaning up this crazy mess. I began helping her and pointing out stupid little details because I still don't understand how this pot flew like 5 or 6 feet through the air and seems to be what hit the fridge before it came crashing to the floor as if someone had picked it up and thrown it across the kitchen. But my grandma, she just stayed silent until it was cleaned up. Once cleaned, we began inspecting the area to now come up with a conclusion of what could have happened. The windows were all closed because, being fall, the basement can get quite cold in the fall and winter months in Canada. They were also way too small for someone to fit through and escape in a matter of seconds, or to be opened from the outside. We tried this many times as kids, in fact, when we forgot our keys and we were locked out after school, and going through that window was just never an option. The simmering pot could have vibrated off the stove, I suppose, but then how did it get like 6 feet across the kitchen and slam into the fridge like that? A few hours later, my grandpa came home and, me being like 8 or 9 years old, ran over screaming. The curry went flying. Of course, he just gave me a big hug and ignored me, figuring that I'm just being a nutty little kid. But that's when my grandma grabbed him, pulling him into the room and closing the door behind them. I snuck up to the door to hear what they were saying, but I couldn't make anything out. But my grandpa is a pretty serious ex-military guy who doesn't really have a sense of humor or mess around unless it comes to us grandkids. And then he's a total clown, making funny faces, telling jokes and stories about whatever he felt was fitting to help guide us youngsters along. He always pushed us to be curious and always helped find answers to the questions that we had. But once he came out of that room, his demeanor was just different. He wasn't his usual smiling, let's play games with grandkids form. He was quiet, rigid, and in thought. They went into the kitchen, and he looked around. I stayed quiet behind both my grandparents, just observing and trying to make sense of it all. We ended up ordering pizza that night, and during pizza, like stupid kids do, and they can't let go of things, I brought up the issue again with my grandpa. He stayed quiet the whole time, and my grandma responded with, "We're not going to be talking about that anymore," in a very stern voice, and I felt like I was sort of in some kind of trouble or something. I never once brought it back up after that, and to this day I still can't explain the mysterious case of the flying curry.